Welcome, everybody. I'm Doug Davis, co-chair of the Serverless Working Group. Scott and Jude will be doing most of the talking, at least initially. This is a little bit of a different session. We are going to give you an overview of the Serverless Working Group itself, so don't worry about that. A little bit talk about serverless, its uses and stuff like that. But we actually want a bigger portion of this section, or this session, to be an interaction with you guys, right? To find out what you guys want from the Serverless Working Group. Because our job here is really to do what you guys want in terms of make your life easier relative to using serverless, right? That's why the cloud event spec that Scott will talk about came up, right? Because we identified a pain point that we want to try to ease for you guys. So we want to hear about your adoption experiences, where you see pain points, why you are or are not using serverless, stuff like that. So that's why we want it to be a little bit of an interaction thing, okay? So with that, here's what we're going to do. Obviously, welcome right now. After that, Scott will talk about Serverless Working Group, latest stuff going on there, a little bit of cloud events, and then Jude will talk about all things serverless, where it's appropriate, and stuff like that. Then we'll go to the birds of a feather type of session. So be thinking as you listen to these two guys about some questions you have around serverless in terms of, like I said, pain points and adoption, and what would prevent you from actually using it yourself, or if you are trying to use it, where those pain points are, because that's what we want to hear. All right? So with that, Scott, you're up.
Howdy. I'm Scott Nichols from Google. I work on Knative at day and cloud events at night. Has anyone used cloud events in the audience? We got one, we got two, three, four. Okay, so it's relatively new. We'll do an intro of it. We started this, a group of people got together and looked at the landscape of all things serverless, and it ended up with a white paper that was published last year. It's still fairly up to date, so you should go take a look if you haven't read it. Through writing that document, one of the things that came out was it's actually difficult to understand semantic meaning of if you live in multiple clouds and you're trying to pass events between multiple locations, it becomes very difficult to understand how to route that message to a configured consumer without understanding the payload. So we needed to figure out a way to help standardize this problem, or this problem needs a solution that's standardized so that independent middleware routing pieces could help your event get to the destination. So we defined a common envelope for the cloud event. So it's this common metadata that's meant for helping a routing device understand where to deliver it to. And we didn't really want to worry about the exact semantics of the payload because that's not actually very important to the middleware pieces. What is important is how that event actually gets to the destination. So we started the CNCF Cloud Events project in December of 2017, and we became Sandbox approved in just last month. Oh, sorry, last year. Yeah, you're right. But did we were to the next stage, or it's okay? We're on the edge of incubation. It's like not ready to incubate, but almost. We have version 3 coming out very soon, and then maybe a 1.0 in a few months. I don't know, several months. So an example of a cloud event. This one happens to be HTTP. Normally, your application would do something like this, where you do a post, and you have some data in the body. But if you make this request and you send it through middleware, how is that middleware supposed to understand the meaning of what your payload is without some common understanding? So what Cloud Events does is says, here's how to understand this, and I don't know exactly what you're going to do with it, but here's some data that I think is pretty standard that you can make choices on how it's going to be routed. And then this same event can be represented in both, so what we call HTTP binary mode or HTTP structured mode. In structured mode is the whole envelope is JSON encoded in the post body. So we have a specification. We also have serialization in JSON, AMQP binary, protobuf. And then we also have a way that helps you understand how to map the actual envelope, the whole, all the attributes and your opaque data onto different transports. So now you can send your event with the correctly configured transport. You could send an event that will be understood on the other side as a cloud event. So you can write your application to be fairly transport agnostic. We have a bunch of SDKs that help kind of facilitate this, this integration. So you don't have to write all this code that's specific to a application. You can use the SDK to help you translate your envelope into the needs of the certain transport you selected. So what's next for cloud events or the serverless working group is we're not really sure. So that's why we're here today. There's some proposals, and we need help to understand what should be a priority for the next work. Or maybe feedback on what's not working with cloud events if you're not using it. Okay. And now Jude's going to talk about serverless functions, because this is a serverless talk.
Hello. Hello. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is specific to serverless. Sorry? Oh, really?
No, it's me. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I'm going to specifically talk about serverless functions. And what I say applies to serverless functions and not serverless, right? So I'm a big proponent of the entire serverless experience. But when it comes to serverless functions, deploying functions in the cloud, there are a lot of different things to consider, right? So we start with when do you use them? And we can draw a quick comparison between object-oriented programming, right? How many of you do Java or Python? Pretty much, like, I think 80%. Right. So these are object-oriented programming languages. And you have high cohesion between a class and an interface. And different classes are loosely coupled, right? You don't use them directly. So what I mean by high cohesion? So a function should do exactly one unit of work. And, sorry, oh, not bad? Yeah, OK. And just that one piece of work, it shouldn't do too many things, right? Functions should be loosely coupled. That means each function shouldn't have like a dependency on another function which has a dependency on another function. We will see why shortly. When you write them, they should be easily testable, right? So when we wrote the KubeCon Cloud Events demo, Doug, Scott, and Klaus, and Owen, right? What really hampered us to get it up and running really quick was debuggability. Because all of us were all isolated as functions in different clouds, we kind of found it hard to debug, right? So that is why you should just write one. That's why they should be highly cohesive and easy to test. Now, coming to portability, today you have various providers like AWS, you have Lambdas, you have Azure, you have Google Cloud Functions, and so on. But if you notice something when you deploy to these guys, OK, so let's take an example. I want to write a function that just does Fibonacci numbers, right? It's a simple function, recursive. Now, the way I deploy it on all these clouds changes from cloud provider to cloud provider. Ideally, my function should just look like define function A in whatever, Python, right? Def function name, and do something, right? If there was a specification around this, I could take this same function and deploy it on every single cloud function provider. But as of today, I cannot. For example, on Lambda, I need to respect, import the Lambda, the packages, right? Same with the other cloud providers. So we do not have anything that's like a generalized specification. So it's not easily portable as of today, at least. And then we come to a couple of examples when these things are useful, right? So serverless functions are really useful. Have you guys ever used Slack? Yeah? All right. How many of you have used the Giphy Slack integration? OK. That's it? Just 3? Oh, you guys are missing out on life then. OK, so let me tell you a bit of what Giphy does then. So say you're debugging a bunch of code and stuff is not working, and you want to vent out your frustration in a graphical form. So you'll say /Giphy /Homer strangling Bart, right? If you guys know Simpsons. And then Giphy will kind of send you a Slack message saying, OK, this is the video or a small GIF of Homer strangling Bart. And do you want to post it, yes or no, right? And then you hit yes, and then it goes onto the Slack channel, and everybody has a good laugh and whatever. So this is a classic example of automating a workflow, right? You have a particular workflow. You want to publish a GIF to the channel, and this entire workflow is perfectly suited for serverless functions, right? Another example is MapReduce. How many familiar with MapReduce? Oh, OK. So yeah, MapReduce, because it just spawns multiple functions. The instances are created, destroyed, just works, right? And then you have parallel workloads. So a really nice popular use case for this is thumbnail generation. You run GraphThur. Do you guys know what GraphThur? Automatics, you associate an image with an email address, right? So to generate thumbnails for this kind of a service, you can use serverless functions. It works really well. And finally, we have a real-life example other than Giphy, which I don't know how it's deployed. We have a real-life example of the CheckTo app, right? So this app, let me tell you a bit what it does. It's basically a GitHub app where every time you create a PR on GitHub, all it does is it checks if you've added any lines that have the word to do in them. OK, so hence the app is called CheckTo. And if you do, all that it does is it just lists it down, and it creates a negative GitHub check. So it's like, OK, hey, you guys have added a couple of to-dos. What to do with them, right? So what do we see from this app? What do we learn from it? We learn that this is 100% stateless, right? I don't need to reference any database because GitHub sends me the link to the PR diff, right? It's independent. It's highly cohesive. It has no dependency whatsoever on anything else. I mean, literally all it is a for loop that just checks if line began with a plus and then string contains to do, right? And if, for whatever reason, millions of repositories use this, as a serverless function, it will scale, it will work beautifully. Completely independent, right? No database connections or anything. Now, coming to considerations, why do I say serverless functions? Why do I say that you need to be careful when using serverless functions? If you write your entire backend in serverless functions, you have functions to take data from a website, push it to a database, and then say later on trigger an email from an email provider, and then run some further computing, processing, and all of that. There is no clear visibility in the flow of this data. What do you have? You have a bunch of functions deployed on a cloud that basically do not tell you how your data is moving. So that's the first consideration that you need to make. Now, with all of these, with fast, functions as a service being a very hot topic these days, and it's a really cool wave. You got to see how these functions are being run, how they're being executed in the background by these major providers. So, for example, some of them, all they do is they just run. They run a binary, a command, like a Go binary or whatever, and they execute it, and they actually use standard input and standard output to communicate with the function. Now, this is it's not highly scalable. Well, it is, but you can throw a lot of money on it. And B, these are just POCs. Now, why do I say? Does anybody in the audience have an idea why I say this is just a POC and not scalable? OK, let's give you an example. Let's take Python, interpreted language. OK, and let's say that your cloud provider is running stdio, right? Standard input, standard output. Now, what's going to happen is for every single call to this function, the Python interpreter is going to be started, destroyed. And if you have 10, let's just say 1,000 concurrent requests, and let's assume that the Python interpreter takes about 2 megabytes of standard memory, right? So you're spending about 2 gigabytes, which is 2 into 1,000. So you're spending about 2 gigabytes in an interpreter overhead, versus if you just ran like a microservice or a stateful service. It would be just the standard 2 megabytes for overhead, and everything else would just be memory that your app actually uses. So that's what I mean when consider how these runtimes run your functions. And then comes resource management, right? So let's take database connections. Postgres, MySQL, MongoDB, all of these are really amazing databases, except for the fact that if you spawn 100,000 connections to them, they will cripple. Well, unless you put them on 2 terabyte boxes and throw money at it. Why? Because these are database connections are inherently expensive. And then comes my last point, the measurement of this is highly related to what I just said. Would you rather do hundreds of function replicas, or rather do two microservices running on a cloud run or some other offering, right? Think about why. So these days, all of the cloud provider functions that you see, their demos are like this, OK? They say OK, standard 5 requests per second. I'm able to, the runtime spawns about 5 instances of a function. And then you up it up to say 10 or 20 requests per second. And then you see, oh God, 20 instances of my function. And at that point, you're like, OK, what happens when I increase my concurrency to 1,000 requests per second? Will I get 100 function instances, or will I get 1,000? Now, this is insane, because if your function made use of a database connection, and you were creating and tearing down those database connections so frequently, you'd be wasting a lot of resources. It's at this point we should think, OK, I will not do function, and instead I will do 2 instances of just a microservice, right? Because it just works. 2 long-lived TCP connections to each database, and you're good to go, right? So this is my consideration point. And now I'll get Doug for the BOF.
All right. OK, cool. Thank you. So as I said, this is going to be a little bit, I don't need it. A little bit of an interactive discussion here, because as I started out with, Serverless Working Group is really about what you guys need in terms of your serverless usage. OK, thanks. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, how many of you guys are actually using serverless in any fashion, not just in production, just at all? Really? Not that, OK, I expected a little more. OK, so, OK. So of the people who actually have used it, how many are using it in production? OK, about the same. No, sorry, crack me up. OK, so what I want to understand is, for you guys who are using it in production, what kind of workloads are you using it on? Actually, Scott, you want to do a favor? Yeah, you can't escape.
I am mic'd.
But,
Here.
yeah. Who wants to offer up what kind of workloads they're using serverless for? I want to pick on him in particular.
Long-running workflows, more like orchestration stuff.
OK.
Primarily, no heavy data usage, but long-living functions, let's say.
OK.
Yeah.
OK. Who else raised their hand using it in production? I'm going to pick on people I know.
So some of our customers are using it for some data enrichment for their products as a reacting to events to, for example, do color classification and updating of existing products in a commerce system.
Okay. Okay, cool. Now, so let me ask you, for everybody else who's actually not using it yet, is there anybody willing to share why they're not using it? Is it simply you just haven't had time to play with it? It's still too new? I'd like to understand what's been any hesitation in terms of why you guys aren't using it, even if it's just to play around with. You can still say. No, okay, yeah, after him, let's go back to the gentleman back there.
Main concern is it's not built as a framework for us, so they're all more or less like the old C style namespace, plain namespace of functions where it's impossible to call anything from the namespace unless you have a direct reference. So you're gonna have to kind of like think of it as like Java packages where you can actually refer to a function or something like that. So like easier invocation for us would have been better. So most of the times we just call functions from outside and it's just a single invocation. And internally it appears to be also very ugly because they're all kind of sort of like you have a very nice Python code, for example, or like anything else. And then inside of this sort of Python code, you have like an ugly call to a Lambda, which doesn't look like anything of your code. It's just a reference to something else. Just ugly. Instead, you could have used a regular, kind of Java-like object with a reference to the name of a function, sort of.
Again, okay.
Yeah.
So you don't see the benefit of basically offloading that work to something outside when you could have just done a normal function call, basically.
Yeah, so we don't see it as a framework yet. We
Right.
see it as just a collection of functions that you have to work with, and you kind of come up with your own naming convention, whatever. It's really not well arranged for us yet.
Do you think, I'm going to keep on picking you for a second,
Yeah.
that's okay. No, you don't.
Oh, okay.
No. So would things like SDKs make that easier?
It would have made it easier if it was better.
Okay. Okay.
But yes, that's the point.
that
Yeah,
kind of
kind of
thing.
like frameworks, specifically higher order functions, existence of those, but that's completely different thing.
Okay,
But
cool, thank you. Let's go back there. Jude, I know it's asking a lot. Can you go over there and see if we can get them to turn down?
Yeah, so basically,
Oh my God.
I have a
freaking loud
software as
over
a
there. See if we
service
can get them to turn
project that I've been kind of working on in my own time as like an independent thing, and I explored using serverless for it, and I wanted that to be like the core guts of the platform, because I like the idea of the kind of automatic scalability and things that serverless offers, but I think that the decoupling is actually the thing that I kept getting tripped up on, that I just had a lot of trouble isolating the logic into specific functions that do one thing, and I kept wanting like a more like directed acyclic graph type thing where a request comes in and then it goes to like maybe this function or maybe this other function, and I just ended up wanting something more like Apache Storm or Heron or Beam or something like that, where you write this sort of complex acyclic graph with the different parts and pieces being independently scalable, like automatically. But the issue there, of course, is that that's all very tightly coupled because it's a complete graph. So maybe so for that reason, I ended up not wanting serverless. Is basically that I couldn't figure out a way to shoehorn what I was doing into the decoupled model.
Yeah, it sounds similar. Yeah, it sounds similar to what you're saying.
Yeah, it's not unrelated.
Yeah, because that's actually one of the things I think a lot of people probably have problems with. We talk about going from a monolith to microservices, and now we're going one step further to functions. And people I think are struggling just going to microservices, and now we're going to ask you to break it up even more. It may be hard for people to understand where do you draw those boundaries, and how do you identify them, and then how do you call them easily without making it feel like there's a ton of overhead. It makes it all worth it and stuff. Go ahead, Scott.
So
I think you push it up.
Hello?
There you
Okay.
go.
So I work on Knative eventing, like I said. And we solve both those same problems using cloud events with the known metadata, and then using the our new model is the broker trigger, which is basically an eventing mesh, and then a query out of that a mesh. So we would make these. So I've been making many examples of these acyclical graphs using kind of hacking the event type to understand what the next stage is. So it says like I'm done with stage 2 or whatever that means, and then it goes back into the broker, and then another query comes out and maybe selects 1 or 2 other functions that go and do some work and then push that event back into the broker, and you get this interesting thing where I have a demo that I could do, or we could do it later, that does reverse Polish notation calculation. And so it like gets a GCS event, it splits the file, it pushes it, makes a new cloud event, pushes it to the broker. A trigger is listening for the expression event. It does one operation and pushes it back until it gets to a result. And you kind of get this interesting thing where it's not coupled and it's testable as a unit, but it's also serverless, and so it scales to as many files as you push in it. So it's possible. And because we're using cloud events, those functions are transport agnostic, so they can be invoked by many different queuing technologies.
Anybody else want to comment on why they are not using serverless today? Oh, gentleman over here.
Hello.
Hello.
So we were always like concerned about the fact that you have this cold startup time that drastically different from the hot execution time, and especially if you're using like AWS and you have Lambda within your VPC, it may take like up to 15 seconds, and you cannot really control it. You cannot say, please always keep like few more Lambdas ready to hold the load.
Interesting. What is an acceptable cold start time in your situation? I'm just curious.
So, for example, like if regular request executes for like, I don't know, like 500 milliseconds, for example, I would say more than a second and a half would be unacceptable, because if you have like function beyond function beyond function, it all like cascades, and in result, customer may, if he's unlucky enough, may wait for like 10-15 seconds and eventually leave the site.
Yep. Okay. Definitely, I've heard that concern raised a lot. So yeah, you're not alone with that. Okay. Anybody else? So, go ahead, Jude. You shouldn't have to touch it. It should be on.
Okay. So what about long-term support? Like, we know VMs are here to stay. We know Kubernetes clusters are like, here to stay. What about long-term support? Like, for example, Google just launched Cloud Run, right? Will they support it for the next 5 years? Because we know for a fact that virtual instances are here to stay, right? You have DigitalOcean, you have AWS, you have all of these. They work, and you can run Kubernetes, etc., these clustering applications on top of them. But what about a very fine, small product that is Cloud Run? Will it stay for the next 5 years?
So let me ask you about that, though, because it seems to me that you can't guarantee that anybody, even the big guys, are going to keep their, well, Google Cloud Run is a big guy, obviously, but even, they may decide to kill it off tomorrow for whatever reason. But it seems to me the thing against that would be portability of your function. But you want to be, but you want to be able to port it to someplace else in case they do go away. Wouldn't that be the bigger solution for that?
So all of this added extra maintenance to my workload, right? Like running an enterprise, we have like a legit product to sell, and people are building features. Now suddenly my DevOps guys are now interested in, oh shit, sorry.
We recorded that. Yeah.
Okay, they're like, oh damn. Google Cloud Run went down. Oh, we have to move to Azure now. And then Azure just terminated because Google saw no value in it. And this is obviously purely hypothetical, but they're very real concerns.
Yeah.
So in the particular case of Knative, this isn't a real concern because the thing you're deploying to Cloud Run is a Knative serving manifest. that has a reference implementation in open source. So you could go and choose to host it on your own K8s cluster that's on-prem, or in IBM Cloud, or in IKS, or pick a Kubernetes cluster. DigitalOcean, right? Like, it's all installable. You can push that contract of how to make a serverless workload into any Kubernetes environment. So Cloud Run is an implementation of the spec that you don't have to manage the cluster and the install of Knative.
Right, you're right. But the bigger point is what he's trying to talk to is Knative is used by many different people, open source. They have their own implementation of it, as well as they use the open source version. But you want portability of your function so that if someone does decide to go down, you can move it someplace else. I would assume that would mainly address your concern. Yeah. Okay.
Is portability of functions really that important? Like, okay, I can move my Lambda code because we live in a perfect world where they all have the same signature. But my serverless app might be using Dynamo, might be using AWS IAM, might be using, okay, Aurora and databases are generally easy to move. But as soon as you go into the whole serverless space, you end up using a lot of very cloud-specific features. You're in AWS, you will likely use Dynamo, you will use IAM. You're in Google Cloud, you will use their AI services because they're awesome, and so on and so forth. You're in Azure, you're going to use their media services. And is there really that much value in being able to move your function if you... It's like using, like doing Kubernetes cross-cloud. It doesn't make sense because you're limiting yourself so much to what's common between all the clouds. So does that make sense? And I guess this is a question for everybody here.
I was going to turn around on them.
Yeah, like there's also a really cool series of blog posts about hexagonal lambdas where every dependency is hidden behind an implementation, and say if you have Dynamo, you can use Dynamo local. You can do stuff in memory to mock and develop locally. But in my opinion, that comes with a lot of mocking. Like, I spent half an hour writing my code and 3 hours writing mocking code to be able to test my function locally. Does that make sense? I've hit this when I did my demo with EKS. Like, there's no way to test IAM Authenticator locally that I found to be easy. Was there any worth in that? What do you all think? So
let me ask a question along those lines. One of the things I hear about when we talk about what the serverless working group should do next, function portability seems to pop up a lot. Function signatures, you want commonality. But then I also hear from other people that porting your function to other platforms, yes, there's a cost because the signature may change, but it's not that big a deal. Right? It may be a little bit of effort, 30 minutes or so to change it over, because most of them do the exact same or have a similar concepts involved. So the portability of the function isn't as big as some people think it is. That's kind of what you're asking. So what are you guys actually using serverless today? Is portability really that big a concern, or is it one of those things that superficially it sounds like it should be, but it's not really that big a deal because you're not changing platforms every 5 minutes, so it doesn't matter? What's been your experience? It's not a big concern.
We didn't think of it much. Okay. But the fact that we didn't think of it much probably suggests that it's not important right now.
Okay, that's good to know. Because as Scott was showing on the previous slide, we had a list of things we were going to talk about in terms of what to work on next. And function signatures was one of the ones that came up there on the vote. And they didn't win on our vote. Actually, workflow popped up as the first thing they wanted to work on next. And so we started working on that a little. But a lot of people keep saying, no, that was a mistake. We should have been doing function API or function signature. But I'm not hearing that it's a huge ask. Maybe the vote was right.
So. Well, this thing with inputs and outputs to functions came up. And if the signature becomes more complex, maybe that'll be an issue. But right now, it's so simple. I don't see how is that going to be any of a problem in any other cloud provider. Okay, yeah, you're going to have to rewrite, I don't know, like 100 signatures, but how much is that?
Right. Okay. Before you give up the mic, well, okay, no, go over here. You got lucky. I will pick on you again, though.
So maybe not the exact portability. But
a little closer?
Maybe not the exact portability, but personally, I want to consume someone else's function. If it's a really high cohesion, And I feel always that reinventing myself. So there's many smart engineers that wrote some functions. So why cannot I just consume the AWS, someone who worked at AWS using the AWS IAM or Aura, and just use that for my business logic. So I always think that.
So that's interesting because we do have things like Docker Hub out there for containers and reuse and sharing that way. Are you suggesting something like a Docker Hub for functions?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Because I have heard that idea mentioned before.
I don't know, but I don't know what would be the solution. But
But you want to be able to easily share functions between people.
Maybe Docker will do, but it's still a little big.
Okay. Cool. Jude.
Think about the Haversign function, right? I'm sure you know what it does. It calculates distance between two places on Earth, right? If there was a function like this, why would I need to keep rewriting this for my service? I could just, as he suggested, a function store could really work. Today that doesn't exist because there is no common spec. So you can't deploy this function wherever you got it from on Lambda or whatever product your company is using today.
Interesting. So, but I want to make sure I understand though. Would you want the function to be pulled down and run in your infrastructure, or do you want to hit it because someone else is hosting it for you? Or both?
Yeah, first, as a developer, I want to load it and test it locally, of course, to see how it exactly behaves. I want to feel safe that even if I'm going to use someone else's code, I want to know how they behave. So I want to capture all of the traffic which is going outside. So probably that's another stuff. But yeah, and then I want to decide which cloud provider to use.
Okay.
If there's a dependency, I'm happy to use that cloud provider, like AWS or Google.
Cool. Before I get to the next question, I want to ask a slightly different question. Oh, go ahead.
Sharing functions and code is still a big issue. Like AWS has the AWS serverless application repository or something like that, where you should share functions, but it's only filled with hello worlds. And that's terrible. Even AWS had a talk where like, hey, how we're using serverless to implement our own services. Like EKS runs, the EKS control plane, the EKS control level runs fully serverless. And they were speaking about how they're doing, like how they package their functions to do automatic retries with dead letter queues and all that. And sharing that, it's still very, very difficult. I don't want to parse GitHub events anymore. I wrote GitHub events parsing hundreds of times. I don't want to do that anymore. I just want to be able to click about it. And we're getting towards that. Like the AWS Serverless repository is helping with this. StorageScript is helping with the coding part. But it seems like we're still so far away, and we keep re-implementing every single thing, every single time for every single service.
Right. Okay. So let me ask a different question. Especially for people who did not raise their hand about using serverless, are you guys actually using Kubernetes? So who's in here using Kubernetes? Okay. I'm actually surprised that everybody's hand did not go up. That's interesting. So for you guys who are using Kubernetes but not serverless, why haven't you made the switch over? No, I'm not going to pick on you anymore. So, gentleman right here. So, because I want to understand, is it just because it's still too new? Is there something about serverless that scares you, or just don't understand? What's the holdback?
I'm yet to find a use case for it. Sorry.
Interesting.
Most of our use cases, we're actually working on a platform for exactly this. We're a single service catalog where developers can actually upload. At the moment, it's Docker services, but we've looked at allowing developers to add their own functions as well. We provide unified billing and everything to go along with that, OpenID Connect authentication. But we internally have no use for serverless. I can see it being used as almost a reactive stage. Mm-hmm. For example, I have a colleague in a different startup who does it for reading from Kafka events and doing stream processing from website tracking, because it's sporadic, it helps scale, and they've never lost an event through it. But we internally, we want to be reactive, so we don't want the cold startup time. Mm-hmm. There reaches a stage where the serverless, as was mentioned before, serverless kind of reaches its limit with database connections, and you are better just using a microservice anyway. So why add the developer complexity and the dev or the operational complexity of managing all the functions when I can just use the microservice in a Kubernetes pod for now, and then it's just going to be there in the future anyway.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Anybody else? Gentleman back there. Let's go with someone new. Now, hand it to the gentleman in the green shirt, and then you can hit it. Thank you, guys. I appreciate the help.
That's a community for you, eh? So I work for Juniper, and like you can imagine, we make hardware. So serverless is like, but we use Kubernetes extensively. And where I see the problem is like, how do we? My biggest problem with serverless is it's a nice hello world application, but then all the problems that you see them just beginning to solve in Kubernetes with Prometheus and Loki and all that, all the problems we already had solved, and microservices came along and broke the world apart, and now we have to resolve them, right? Remember that? This is now another case of that. How are we going to do all those things? Because our customers are all going to go, yeah, that's very nice. How do we know what the hell happened? Yep. That's the question they ask us, right? So, you know, firewalls and security and all that kind of stuff. And big banks and things like that. Serverless is, what are they going to use that for? So it's a question that I'm asking. I can see maybe in provisioning, that's something where we have a lot of events, like infrastructure as code. That's my baby. It's like trying to make people use that for their networks. And that's where serverless might have like a real niche, because we already use things like Salt and those Salt Stack and stuff like that, which is all event-based. So maybe that's an application where we could use serverless, and we could use this serverless thing, because it wouldn't be something you're not going to put on the cloud necessarily. It'd be something where you'd have your local serverless implementation, which is what you're talking about, which is kind of why I came to your talk, because local serverless implementation. This is something we can be interested in.
Right.
So yeah, so from my point of view, why we don't really use serverless is that tracing capability of like, what happened?
Yep.
You know, what just happened? We spoke to 20 different things, and there's no way of, how do you know? I don't know if there's an answer to that question, or is that just still to do?
I think it's
my falls
personal
under
opinion,
that to-do serverless app.
Yeah, I think that's still a little bit of a newer area for serverless, and I think that's what Jude was alluding to. It's difficult to debug some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's what we found with our event-driven stuff.
Right.
It's really hard to keep track of all the things that happened, and that matters to our customers, right? When you say the firewall rules didn't get created in the right order, you end up in the newspaper.
Right.
So that's bad. So that's why it's kind of like, I'm not sure if it's useful for, well, it may be useful, we just haven't fixed that problem.
Right. Okay. Anybody else want to comment on, let's go over here.
I could be ignorant, by the way.
Well, actually, his hand might have been up first, and then we'll go over here. Now, there are no wrong opinions on this. The whole point of this is to gather your input, whether you're right or wrong. That way we can take it back and think about it and think about what we need to do next. Because some of the stuff, I haven't heard anything that I have not heard before. So so far, everything sounds valid to me in terms of potential problems.
Yeah, so maybe to speak more for our customers in the past, so coming from old systems like SAP systems, the customers, if they do extensions, that is not a huge application programming, right? It's usually some few lines of codes to extend the business process, for example. And in the past, we saw many customers using this kind very easy and lightweight functions. That was not called functions, was called differently. But that is widely adopted, actually, in these old application systems. So I'm not sure whether we have here the right people, right? The real users of functions, whether they are represented here, or whether it should be more companies who just use software and not develop software, because those have an interest of functions, and I guess what they need is a good discoverable of options, so APIs and events. So and therefore, kind of event catalogs and registries matters, so that they can easily, for example, get an event for invoice created or master data changed or something, so that they can really extend these kind of business logic, and that makes sense. So I would like to ask the workgroup more to look into subscription APIs, which is listed here, but also the capability to expose event types in form of catalogs, which, I mean, there are protocols out, like Async API, for example, or Open API. So this connection to these, to make things discoverable and usable in the context of serverless functions, that is, I guess, important so that you can reach your real customers, because I don't believe that the real customers are here in the room.
Okay, interesting. Good. Actually, what's interesting is the subscription API line is something I added just recently, simply because it has come up several times that as we start working on the Knative project in particular, we want to help people automate the process of getting those or subscribing to the event producers.
Exactly.
And we wanted to know whether having a common API to do that is something that's actually needed, or it's not that big a deal because it's not that hard for you to actually make the connection yourself. So you're saying a common API, a subscription API, actually may be useful for the scenarios you're seeing.
Yeah, definitely, because I mean, if you have a function on a cloud infrastructure which wants to get an event, let's say, from a business system, then you would like to subscribe also in a similar way and not learn this and this variant, right, to do that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Anybody else want to comment before I ask a question? Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot about you. I apologize.
So just a very quick but like forward-looking question. So there are a lot of talk about like Cloudflare, Fastly, they all use like WASM, WebAssembly for their serverless. So it's sort of different from what we are talking about in Kubernetes world, like Knative. So I'm wondering what's your opinion. So do you think there will be a like platform in serverless similar to Kubernetes that could support like either micro VMs or container-based or even WebAssembly-based serverless offerings?
I don't know. Honestly, I personally haven't thought about that. Anybody else in the working group want to comment on that?
You could implement that using Knative.
Scott, I can't hear you.
I can hear me. You could implement like a JavaScript function framework inside of Knative using the runtime contract, because it's really all it is it's you have a container and you host yourself on 80 or 8080, and you get some environment variables.
Thank you. I wanted to get back at something the gentleman behind me was hinting at. Do you already see some kinds of, well, best practices or good practices emerging in this realm of observability in serverless? Because at least in my mind, this whole pull-based thing where you have this Prometheus instance which pulls all your metrics from your microservices works very well there. And it's really nice if you can instrument all your libraries and so on, and also your infrastructure. But do you guys already see something emerging in the serverless world, basically across clouds?
Yeah. Do you? You want to say this? Go ahead.
I have many opinions on this. So, as the gentleman in the back has said, observability for serverless, it's harder than for microservices. But that's not necessarily because it's a new technology or because it's different. It's because you have a lot more tiny pieces. If you have three microservice with 3 replicas, okay, you can kind of stream the logs if there are not too many. You can still SSH into more kubectl exec, which is the new SSH, into each container and see what's happening in there. If you have the same app in serverless, you're not going to have 3 replicas. You're going to have like hundreds or thousands of function invocations. And what I really like about serverless is the fact that it is forcing you to add observability. If you don't follow best practices, you cannot do serverless, and you are going to have a ton of issues. For microservices, for Kubernetes, you can do stuff like downtime windows. You're just going to delete all the deployments, and you're going to launch new versions. For serverless, you cannot do that. You have to code your app in such a way that it supports rolling deploys. Like, that's not even an option. And there are a lot of apps written and that are being worked right now that don't support this. Serverless is forcing you to support this. It's forcing you to instrument your function because you don't have the visibility into it. And that's more of an issue of something that I believe we all have been ignoring, which is an issue. Like, we aren't focusing as much as we should on observability. And I'm quoting a lot from Charity Majors, who was the CEO of Honeycomb and now is the CTO of Honeycomb. They are very, very focused on observability. They have serverless observability in their examples, and it helps a lot. Lightstep also is another vendor who helps a lot with this. But you cannot just have a function and copy-paste your code from a microservice where you have like printf logs, and you go into CloudWatch, you see the ton of log streams, you're like, oh my god, what did I get myself into? Serverless is really forcing these best practices in software development, in software delivery, in actually running software. And I don't really believe that's an issue of the framework. It's an issue of how we need to develop software for this. It needs to be focused.
So while the mic's going to him, two things. You can go hand on the mic, two things. One, I'm not just texting up here, I'm actually taking notes on my phone. I wasn't just ignoring you guys. I realized as you guys were talking, my memory is not good enough. I'm going to forget everything you said, so I better start writing it down. But two, I like what you were saying there, but I think more directly to your question, though, was, are the tools in place to actually do this stuff? And what are the best practices? Because you're right, it may force you to do the best practices, but do we have the best practices in place to actually give people the direction? And I have my own opinion, but I'd like to hear what other people think about whether we actually do have the best practices yet, because I think I know the answer, but I want to hear from other people first.
Frankly, I'm totally siding with you about practices because, serverless kind of leaning towards functional style and functional kind of pure functional style. So you probably should sometimes ask yourself, if that doesn't work for you that well, maybe you're doing something wrong in the first place. And I'm not saying that you're coding, it's a bad code, maybe just not using serverless as it's meant to be used, and it's just a bad application. Say pure functional style just would imply that you can test functions without side effects. And then your observability by itself is kind of even questionable, because if you can run it here, then you can run it here, and it's fully reproducible, and it's, basically it's about functional purity. So I know it's a bit more like abstract, and real world is very different, but at the same time there is a piece of there's something in this, like some things you can do in a different way, and then all the problem may just go away. And that actually happened a few times when we just started thinking differently a little bit about different problems, and suddenly observability by itself stop being such a pain in the butt.
Interesting. Okay. Wait, before we go back to him, anybody else? Gentleman right there.
Actually, I have a question.
I think it's on. You just need to speak up. Try to yelling into it, basically.
Hello?
There you go. Thank you.
Yes, actually, I have a question. I mean, when we think about function perspective, we can think like, is it pure stateless function or stateful function? I mean, is it idempotent function or not? So in real world, we don't have too many cases like calculate Fibonacci. What we do, we mostly need to create some states, and we aggregate some data, and then process through somewhere, and we change something. And this is mostly not idempotent. My question is, with this approach, is if we already trigger an event, and if it starts to work somewhere in the Kubernetes and Knative, is it possible to kill it, stop it somehow, to find it? And second question, and if there's an event, it means there's also a queue, and our resources are already limited. So we may not just fire the same function, maybe not 10 times. Maybe we will give a slot like just at the same time on just a five function can run parallel. So if someone already trigger an event, and if the event was sitting in the queue, is there a possibility to disable it, cancel it?
So I think you're asking very specific implementation questions, in particular about Knative, which are great questions, but can we save that for after? Because a lot of us work on Knative, and we can answer those questions in particular, but I'd rather try to keep the conversation more generic for serverless in general. Otherwise, it's going to turn into a Knative session. If that's okay with you. I do want to get to it. It's just, I don't want to turn into a Knative session.
So the idea of having a function have state is kind of interesting because...
Scott, can you speak up a little?
So, okay, think about this. What the state of computing was about 10 years ago versus what it could be in 10 years. The function can have state. It's in some sort of blob store database thing, and we're worried today about connections to the database and scale of the functions like starving the service. Well, what if that database was also serverless and it could scale equally as well as the consumers of that? And so now that function can just slurp in its state and then do its operation and then push back that state when it's done. It could be that we're trying to optimize for today's constraints where we could kind of pay a little penalty and then in 10 years we're in a different state where all of our databases actually do scale to 10,000 things, trying to hit it in bursty sessions. So there's a kind of a mental thought change.
So a lot of you guys have been talking about events, and I'm curious, is that really where you see serverless's sweet point in terms of processing events? Or is it just generic triggers, any kind of message coming in? Or is it really just events in your mind that really is the serverless sweet point? Because I've seen people use serverless frameworks for things that have nothing to do with events. And I'm wondering whether that's just weird or whether that's just something most people aren't thinking of yet. What is your opinion in terms of what serverless is for? Go ahead, Scott. Is it just for events, or is it just pretty much anything that wants to do auto scaling and other type of serverless features?
Well, I want to use it in the edge.
In what?
On the edge.
A little closer. On the edge.
On the edge computing.
Okay.
So my main concern was I don't want to occupy the resource on the edge. For if you implement the microservice or VM or something in the edge, you cannot get rid of it, even you don't have the jobs running, right? So my main concern was putting serverless there so you can only occupy the resources when you have actual jobs. So that was my thought to when I was.
So it sounds to me as though it's not necessarily about the type of thing coming in, whether it's a event or something else. It's you want the auto scaling, possibly scale down to zero type of stuff. So
right. Because I have something important running on the edge.
Right.
Something else, let's say NFE, and I have some available resources for general purpose.
Right.
But those resources not available for any time. For example, the other application can scale out, then these available resources will go to zero in milliseconds.
Okay.
So I don't want to keep it up for any other general purpose tasks.
Okay.
So that was my use case.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on the question? Gentleman over here.
Thank you. About our use case, we want to, about the input.
Try to yell into the microphone.
Okay. About the input to the function, we want to take care of the media process, media stream. So in our use case, it was video traffic that could last 30 minutes or hours, while the video conferences.
So I'll make sure I understand that. So you basically want the input trigger or stream. So you want the function to basically stay alive for 30 minutes doing processing?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, but we built our platform because it was not there at the market. So we built a new platform using the Kubernetes, which I gave a talk yesterday. But the point is that there is a trigger for that. So like a session open event or something, that we will start a video conference. That's kind of the event to spawn up the function. But the actual event, actual input for that function is streaming data. So that's something that probably it's a little bit different to the typical function, I think. We are doing cloud-based media processing. So streaming, converting, everything. We provide the platform to let user write their own code to do manipulation, or just call the Google speech to text and just write down to the text or something.
Of course you do, Vlad.
I talk a lot. Sorry, you can just ban me. Yeah, the client I did my demo with yesterday is Amazon. They're also doing media workflows, and those are super, super, super event-driven. Like you have a file come in, a movie, frames, whatever. You want to transcode them. It's very much event-driven, and it's a perfect use case for serverless. And getting back to the earlier question, why are people, why are some people using Kubernetes but not serverless? Like we looked into running serverless frameworks on Kubernetes, and in my opinion, on our opinion, I'm gonna speak for myself. In my opinion, those were not yet ready. Like you get more benefits and a high reliability from Kubernetes. A lot of frameworks are getting there. Nucleo, OpenFast, Knative is getting there. Iguazio's framework is getting there. Kubeless was also doing a lot of stuff for Kubernetes because we had issues with containers being killed. So I do believe that, yes, especially for media, which is why I want to know what you do. It's so event-driven, but serverless is not yet catching up there.
Interesting. Okay, that's interesting. So let me ask a different question. This may be more for the people who are actually using serverless. What is it about serverless that appeals to you? Because I've heard some people talk about it's difficult to figure out how to break things up into functions and making them small and stuff. That's obviously a problem. But what features of serverless actually drew you to it? Is it the fact that it's functions in small little pieces, or is it the auto scaling? Is it being able to scale down to 0? Is it the responding to events? What is it about the serverless concept that actually is appealing to people? I'd like to get these two, if possible, to speak up.
Very simple. It's serverless.
Say that again?
It's serverless.
Yeah, but what does that mean? but what does that mean to you? Just say it's serverless.
Overhead of not having servers, and it's just, well, you still have to do some kind of provisioning and put those lambdas or like anything you're dealing with somewhere.
Right.
But we don't know. We don't have to do any servers, any kind of like the normal continuous. It's like infrastructure, basically. The infrastructure-related overhead that we have to otherwise would have to deal with, we don't.
So if I offered you up a service that said, "I'll host any generic container you want for you," I'm not going to call it serverless. I'm just going to say it's containers as a service. Right? It's just give me your container, I'll host it for you. That's good enough for you.
No, but that's one of the arguments.
Okay.
It's one of the arguments. The other argument is, of course, that you could one of the arguments, let's say. There are others are less important, they say, but the other one is kind of, I guess it's just conveniently placed somewhere. You know, it's all the flexibility that comes with working in, sort of in the cloud, or it's sort of like a platform. But yes, that's serverless.
It's okay, understood.
What's a huge thing for us is just how well it integrates with other proprietary services of cloud providers. I mean, maybe also an upside for let's say on Amazon Web Services, you have data in Kinesis streams, and then you can just put in the function behind that, and they are triggered on events, something like this. And maybe this is also something one could go into the direction of how to glue together maybe open source services or other standards. Maybe there could be a generic way to call some kind of, I don't know, function specification from Kafka, or I don't know. But if you're working somewhere that is going all in on, say, AWS, it's just super convenient to use Lambda because, things work together, and you're almost pushed into using it.
Interesting. So that would almost imply, you can hit the microphone, that almost implies that if Lambda was there by itself in isolation, I'm not mentioning Lambda to pick on Amazon, but if you had something like Lambda in isolation without the back-end services available, it may not be as attractive to you. That's interesting. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, for business applications, the extensibility is very important so that customers can evolve in their own speed with their own innovation needs and agility. And yeah, these kind of business application, so the users on top are not, well, pretty often not the well-experienced developer, right? So the skill set is low. It's a human factor. We have a broader reach. We can reach more people who can extend business applications, and that makes it so valuable.
Interesting. Okay. Anybody else want to join in or add to that? Gentleman here.
So from my perspective, besides the typical benefit, I feel that it's a opinionated way. How to write the software. So as he said, we need to implement in the best practice manner if we do the serverless. Right. And Kubernetes is an opinionated platform to manage infrastructure application. And I think serverless could be an opinionated way to write a software. So because I need to write in the event-driven. Nothing else is it's allowed, but it will mess up. Right. So that's the benefit that I'm looking.
Okay, cool, thank you. Gentleman over here.
Just correct me if I'm wrong. So I think we can think a case like in Kubernetes to run a batch kind of jobs. What we have, just you can create a kind job, or you can run a cron job. Or in Unix philosophy, you can have a cron job. And when we look through the cron jobs, what is the main things? In period of time, you want to do some sort of things. But just also there might be some requirement that only the function provide this on-demand request, like to run something. And if we don't have some certain of period to run those on-demand things, you cannot create cron jobs. And whenever you need to trigger a job to do something, like for instance, some files already started to get bigger and you want to shift them somewhere, and periodically. And you already have some criteria to actually run that function. And for me, it is not nice to create job metadata job pod in the Kubernetes every time, and in that way, maybe it is good to you already have an on-demand function, and if your credentials, if your criteria already supported, then run the function. So in that area, maybe just the events. This is why already fits well for serverless.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay, hold on. Let's see what, I can't remember what the next question was. We already talked a little bit about that. Okay. So, actually, relative to the workloads that you guys are seeing for serverless, are there certain workloads that you think are not good fits but should be? Because I think your use case was interesting, the streaming one. Because I think depending on who you talk to, some people would say, yes, we have the exact same use case. We want functions that live for a long time, whether it's because the input data or the trigger is a stream, or just because it takes a long time to get its job done. Either way, it's going for a long time. Other people look at that and say, that's not serverless. Serverless is short-lived, right? And it depends on your mindset. So aside from things like long-running jobs in general, that I'm hearing from you, are there other types of workloads that you are hearing are not suited for serverless, but you like them to be? And there's something that's stopping you from, gentlemen out there, there's something that's stopping you from actually running those kind of things.
Orchestration. Sometimes jobs just need to run a long time, and functions just remain idle. So in AWS, you can use step functions and then play with events and blah, blah, blah. But generally speaking, it's just another object or element that I need to create and be aware of. Whereas I don't see why they wouldn't just let my function or like the instance that runs my functions stay idle and then wake up, because right now they have a hard stop on 5 minutes or something like that on Lambdas. So that just kind of is annoying.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand. So, because part of that is implementation choice by Lambda.
Yes.
But when your function is idle, do you mean it's idle because it's waiting for something
Yeah,
else to finish?
it's waiting for some resources
okay.
or
so it will wake back up due to the original request. It's
Yeah.
just something else is going off and busy.
Strictly
Okay.
speaking, yeah, if you play with a synchronous pattern correctly, you could work around that and implement two parts of a function. But again, that's something that other people should be aware of. Whereas like futures, for example, would just address this in a very natural way, except that it doesn't work in lambdas.
Right. Right. Like you said, it is possible to do it, but it makes it much harder to do it and shy away from it. Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. But that does lead into another question that I have, which is, while it is a Knative question, it's not. It's kind of related. It's not directly Knative. One of the things that I personally have been thinking about and trying to promote, mainly because of Knative, is this idea of trying to bring serverless and containers as a service, platform as a service, all merged together. Because at the base level, it's all just a container, right? And it's sort of the stuff around it that may make it a little different. Serverless, you have auto scaling, scale down to 0, stuff like that. But do you guys agree that this merging of the world that we're seeing with things like Knative is a good thing? Or do you actually think that there really are separate pillars? Like, no, Cloud Foundry is distinctly different from vanilla Kubernetes, is distinctly different from serverless, and we actually do need to keep them separate? Or do you think merging actually may be a good thing? Just curious to know what your guys' opinion is on that, if you have one. Or do you not even care, as long as it works? You almost raised your hand. You want to do it?
So, I think that, how do I say this? I think that Kubernetes the success of Kubernetes to some extent is a response to a certain provider's dominance. Let's just be honest here in the room. And
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I couldn't possibly. And I think the point raised earlier by the I think from T-Systems, is that once again, all of the functions, and there will be like pre-built functions, right, that you can use. I'm sure a registry. I think that a great feature for serverless functions will be being able to just say this function is in GitHub. And as long as the GitHub repo is a certain format, it automatically would just acquire that. And you don't even have to write it. You just go, that URL, run that serverless function. So that would be kind of handy. That would be the kind of thing that I would do if I was doing this thing. And that would be a nice, easy way of doing it open source, right? Then you can just put your serverless function out there. It can be popular, and people can use it, and you can tell how many people have used it, yeah, right? Just the same as you would for a Docker container. So you don't need to have Docker Hub. Just use GitHub. And then the thing is, then the response, I think serverless is different from containers. I think, yes, you're going to, just in the same way that you can run Kubernetes on top of a VM, and the same way that you run this Knative thing on top of Kubernetes, it's all a response to try and keep, in a way, a kind of check and a balance, right? So that at the other side, there's always the option of going with this open source, open standard, and that's really useful. And I think they are different, serverless and Kubernetes and containers and whatever, but they represent the open standard for those things, as opposed to the other side of the force, shall we say.
So let me poke on that a little, if you don't mind.
Okay.
You said serverless is different than Kubernetes. Does that imply that you believe somebody running a vanilla Kubernetes pod will not want similar functionality that serverless offers?
No, I don't believe that. It's a matter of layers.
Interesting.
So some people will get kit, right? Like federal customers. They are going to have their own kit, but they also might like VMs, and then they will also like to put Kubernetes on there, and then they'd also like to have serverless themselves, all implemented in their own black ops data center, which I can't talk about, otherwise I'll have to kill you all. But you get the idea, right?
Yeah.
So yes, of course these things will all be separate. As technologies, they're separate, and as you use them differently. They're operationally different. You have different you might not have different teams, but you have different skill sets, right?
Interesting.
So you're never gonna So the point that he made about observability, which I take, by the way, that one about you should have in every function like the necessary stuff to log, not log, create the right metrics or whatever, so that, that makes perfect sense. That is the answer to the question of observability, that you actually have to, every function must tell something else. Of course, that's going to generate a heap of traffic, but we'll talk about that at a different time. Yeah, so I don't know, I do see them as different, absolutely. But I think that, to my mind, that's how I think commercially. It's just like there has to be a way of creating a standard. We had the same problem like 20 years ago. We were all writing RFCs, right? And all the kids that were there writing the RFCs, back then I was a kid. Then we were like doing the same thing. We were saying, oh, this is how we're going to do it. And we were agreeing, and we agreed standards, and then the internet and all the different standards you see today, like all the different broadcast, multicast, all these kind of things. It's the same now. We're basically doing the same process, except the RFCs are GitHub repos.
Right.
So if you have a GitHub repo, it feels the same as when we were writing these RFCs. And that's what you are. You write a GitHub repo with a bunch of code in, and then you get to present at the conference, and then it becomes the standard for the industry. So I think this is really exciting, because it's that part where we go from, we always had a proprietary way of transmitting packets across the internet. Now we've had to open that all up, so it's all open standards, which enabled this wave, right? Sorry, I'm getting a bit philosophical.
It's okay.
But you get the idea.
Yeah, I do.
So I'd see them as separate technologies and separate streams.
Okay, I appreciate that. Gentlemen, back to the gentleman in the green.
Actually, I have one more question about not the question, just a suggestion about
Can you speak up just a little?
Limitation of serverless. I mean, the exact meaning of serverless. And one of the guy in here already mentioned about Apache Storm. And there are some concepts. And actually, I don't know where serverless already fits in. For instance, Apache Storm is the really good implementation of flow-based programming, which came from 1970s. What it does, it already have execution, input, and output. And also with serverless, and there are too many function words that already relies on it. So do we mean with serverless as a methods or pure functions? So actually there are three concepts. So just a difference of the methods and the functions in a simple way, what we have in Golang, for instance, we have injector, right, for the functions. If you already keep the object inside the function, so it is not a function anymore, it's just a method. Already retrieve the object state, it can change it, or it might not change it, and then create do some things. And in that, so for methods, actually serverless, I would like to use it at methods my events will be the main object, and with that events, I would like to run my methods in the serverless domain. Or should it be only go through pure functional, like Haskell function implementation? So maybe it might be good to really clarify the borders of what we mean by serverless. They're going to use like flow-based, like methods, or like pure function.
Anybody have any? I don't personally have an answer to that. Anybody else want to comment on that? Because I think it's a great question. I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier: is where do you draw the boundary between microservice, function? How do you split it up? Where do you split it up? I don't think there's a clear answer for that. Anybody want to?
Yeah, because in theory, a function is not a function, so it has to be separated and clarified really well.
Right. Sorry, just taking some notes here.
I had a similar comment that maybe also this relates to, is that one of the things that we really find is that, especially at our customers, that using serverless in a very productive way for the customers is still some of the mysteries that is kind of black knowledge kept inside some people's heads who already successfully did that inside some I don't know, companies or something. Exactly as it was, I don't know, tens of years ago for how to do proper development, software development, and before the open source world. So kinda, I'm thinking if the serverless working group would be leading in sharing these or opening up these stuff, kind of like Richard Stallman did in the past. This is one comment that probably related to this.
Yeah, because we definitely heard people want best practices. I think it goes hand in hand that, but it's not the phrase best practices doesn't describe it. It's more like document your experience with it, your findings, your learnings, so other people can learn from that as well. I don't know what the word is for that, but yeah. Okay.
One other comment, it's related to that question, which there was a previous talk by Jonas, the CTO of Lightbind in this conference, about stateful functions, which is pretty interesting and also made me personally at least think that the model of the actor model that was at some time the peak of the interest in the industry probably fits in the serverless world and also probably on the Kubernetes environment some sort. So this is also something that currently is not under heavy focus of serverless, but probably fits there.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that? Oh, gentleman over here.
Hello. Actually, the comment to your question about if serverless should merge with, tie with container or not. I don't have an answer, but like the man already left said that WebAssembly.
Say it again.
WebAssembly is emerging, and I don't know if WebAssembly would marry well with the Docker containers at the first place. So just curious, but.
Well, personally, I think Knative is trying to merge the two, or merge all of them together. Because I personally use, Knative is advertised as a serverless, depending on who you talk to. I personally use it as Kubernetes. I don't use it as serverless. I have used it as serverless, but I don't, usually. And so to my mind, they are kind of merged together. So you're asking, I think you were asking, what are there people who actually are trying to merge it? I think Knative is.
The question is if WebAssembly would merge well with the containers or not. WebAssembly can be run without containers.
I'm sorry, it's really loud next to us.
WebAssembly, yeah.
I repeat the question?
WebAssembly?
WebAssembly.
WebAssembly.
Yeah, anybody here know WebAssembly want to comment on that? WebAssembly?
WebAssembly.
Yeah, but does it work well with?
It's to pack a binary, right? Yeah. And Cloudflare, for example, does the serverless with WebAssembly, with B8 engine. That probably doesn't use Kubernetes, I guess.
But are you asking whether WebAssembly works well with serverless in general? Or
Also,
what your question is?
So you asked that if the serverless working group should consider tie with the containers.
Yeah.
But for example, there is another technology like WebAssembly.
Right.
And I'm wondering whether we should consider that case
I see what you
as
mean.
a runtime. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I'll add that to the list of things to think about. Go ahead.
Since we're discussing serverless, we are focusing on serverless functions, but there are a lot of other serverless services, I guess. That sounds weird. Like S3 could be considered serverless. We have stuff like Aurora serverless. There are other things that could be considered serverless. Do you believe the serverless working group should do something about that? And if so, what?
Wait, repeat the question. Do something about what?
We're focusing on functions, on serverless functions.
Well, serverless.
Serverless functions.
Serverless. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there are other serverless services. S3 could be considered serverless. Aurora serverless has serverless in the name. Fargate, which is running a container, Google Cloud Run, which is running a container, they could be considered serverless.
Yeah.
Should the working group be doing anything about those?
Well, personally, I think anything's fair game as long as it doesn't stray too far from that. But what other people think? I mean, is extending it beyond serverless functions something that you guys think we should consider?
So just to amplify.
You just yell into it. It's on.
Oh, okay.
And then we're almost out of time. We'll go to his comment and then we got to stop.
So I just think that serverless is inclusive of everything, and serverless functions to be completely different from serverless. Yes, pods can be deployed. Yes, I think personally, if you have a managed Kubernetes engine, I think it's freaking serverless ready because I'm not really managing the nodes, right? But serverless functions is just one small unit, like a function. That's precisely what I think. And I'm frankly surprised that everybody seems to confuse the two together.
Yep. Okay. All right. I do want to get the gentleman over there, a non-regular person.
Oh yeah. I think this could get more complex. I mean, just a simple function is not equal to serverless, right? It can be calling functions through the functions, and something like function chaining. That could be equal to the method, this gentleman was saying earlier. And I think we should have more broad vision on the serverless because it's not about the functions. There are some other technologies, like for example, like media streaming. It's not the simple function, right? So it could fetch the data from the outside, and you have another lot of functions working inside the function. So for my personal opinion is we should not put it as simple as a function equals serverless. So there's much broad definition about serverless.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Just have an opinion.
No, that's good. That's good. I'm glad to hear it. And technically, we are out of time. I thank you guys very much for joining. Hopefully, of those who are not using serverless yet, hearing the discussion may give you some insight into some of the issues you may have to think about, when to use it, when not to use it. So hopefully, it was useful even to you guys who aren't using it yet. But from our point of view, from the serverless point of view, thank you for all your input. And hopefully, this was a little bit entertaining, if nothing else, to hear the back and forth discussions. Do have some information here about the Serverless Working Group, the cloud events information if you're interested. But thank you guys for making it an interactive discussion. I was a little afraid you guys would be quiet, but you did step up. I appreciate it. So thank you very much.